As Secretary of State, my job is to make sure our foreign policy delivers for the American people by taking on the biggest challenges they face and seizing the biggest opportunities that can improve their lives. No challenge more clearly captures the two sides of this coin than climate. If America fails to lead the world on addressing the climate crisis, we won't have much of a world left. If we succeed, we'll capitalize on the greatest opportunity to create quality jobs in generations. We'll build a more equitable, healthy, and sustainable society, and we'll protect this magnificent planet. That's the test we face right now. Today, I want to explain how American foreign policy will help us meet that test. Not too long ago, we had to imagine the impact of climate change. No one has to imagine it anymore. For the last 60 years, every decade has been hotter than the one that came before it. Weather events are becoming more extreme. During the cold wave this February, temperatures from Nebraska to Texas were more than 40 degrees below normal. In Texas alone, thousands were left homeless. Over 4 million people went without heat and electricity. More than 125 people died. It may seem counterintuitive that global warming leads to cold weather. But as the Arctic warms, cold weather gets pushed south, and that can contribute to record cold spells like the one in Texas. The 2020 wildfire season burned more than 10 million acres. That's more than the entire state of Maryland. We saw 5 of the 6 biggest wildfires in California's history and the single biggest wildfire in Colorado's history. Together, natural disasters in 2020 cost the United States around $100 billion. Meanwhile, 2019 was the wettest year on record for the lower 48 states. Heavy rains and floods prevented farmers in the Midwest and Great Plains from planting 19 million acres of crops. And from 2000 to 2018, the American Southwest experienced its worst drought since the 16th century. The 16th century. We're running out of records to break. The costs in monetary damage, livelihoods, human lives keep going up. And unless we turn this around, it's going to get worse. More frequent and more intense storms, longer dry spells, bigger floods, more extreme heat, and more extreme cold, faster sea level rise, more people displaced, more pollution, more asthma, higher health costs, less predictable seasons for farmers. And all of that will hit low-income, black and brown communities the hardest. The last part is important. The costs of the climate crisis fall disproportionately on the people in our society who can least afford it. But it's also true that addressing climate change offers one of the most powerful tools we have to fight inequity and systemic racism. The way we respond can help break the cycle. These are all reasons why we must succeed in preventing a climate catastrophe. But the world has already fallen behind on the targets we set 6 years ago with the Paris Agreement. And we know that those targets didn't go far enough to begin with. Today, the science is unequivocal. We need to keep the Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid catastrophe. America has a key role to play in hitting that mark. We only have around 4% of the world's population, but we contribute nearly 15% of global emissions. That makes us the world's second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. If we do our part at home, we can make a significant contribution to addressing this crisis. But that won't be enough. Even if the United States gets to net zero emissions tomorrow, we'll lose the fight against climate change if we can't address the more than 85% of emissions coming from the rest of the world. Coming up short will have major repercussions for our national security. Pick a security challenge that affects the United States. Climate change is likely to make it worse. Climate change exacerbates existing conflicts and increases the chances of new ones, particularly in countries where governments are weak and resources are scarce. Of the 20 countries the Red Cross considers most vulnerable to climate change, 12 are already experiencing armed conflicts. As essential resources dwindle, as governments struggle to meet the needs of growing populations, we'll see more suffering and more strife. Climate change can also create new theaters of conflict. In February, a Russian gas tanker sailed through the Arctic's northern sea route for the first time ever. Until recently, that route was only passable a few weeks each year. But with the Arctic warming at twice the rate of the rest of the global average, that period is getting much longer. Russia is exploiting this change to try to exert control over new spaces. It is modernizing its bases in the Arctic and building new ones, including one just 300 miles from Alaska. China is increasing its presence in the Arctic too. Climate change can also be a driver of migration. There were 13 Atlantic hurricanes in 2020, the highest number on record. Central America was hit especially hard. Storms destroyed the homes and livelihoods of 6.8 million people in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and wiped out hundreds of thousands of acres of crops, leading to a massive rise in hunger. Months after the storms, entire villages are still subsumed in mud, and people are carving off pieces of their buried homes to sell as scrap metal. When disasters strike people who are already living in poverty and insecurity, it can often be the final straw, pushing them to abandon their communities in search of a better place to live. For many Central Americans, that means trying to make it to the United States, even when we say repeatedly that the border is closed, and even though the journey comes with tremendous hardships, especially for women and girls who face heightened risk of sexual violence. All of these challenges are placing greater demands on our military. The U.S. Naval Academy is only 5 miles north of here, and Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, about 200 miles to the south. Both bases and the critical missions they support face an imminent threat from climate change. And these are just two of the dozens of military facilities that climate change puts at risk. What's more, our military often responds to natural disasters, which are getting more frequent and more destructive. In January, Secretary of Defense Austin announced that the military would immediately integrate climate change into its planning and operations and how it assesses risk. As Secretary Austin put it, and I quote, "There is little about what the department does to defend the American people that is not affected by climate change." Having said all that, it would be a mistake to think about climate only through the prism of threats. Here's why. Every country on the planet has to do two things: reduce emissions and prepare for the unavoidable impacts of climate change. American innovation and industry can be at the forefront of both. This is what President Biden means when he says, and I quote, "When I think of climate change, I think jobs," end quote. To give you a sense of scale, consider that by 2040, the world will face a $4.6 trillion infrastructure gap. The United States has a big stake in how that infrastructure is built. Not only whether it creates opportunities for American workers and businesses, but also whether it's green and sustainable and done in a way that's transparent, respects workers' rights, gives the local population a say, and doesn't mire developing countries and communities in debt. That's an opportunity for us. Or consider the massive investments countries are making in clean energy. Renewables are now the cheapest source of bulk electricity in countries that contain 2/3 of the world's population. And the global renewable energy market is projected to be $2.15 trillion by 2025. That's over 35 times the size of the current market for renewables in the United States. Already, solar and wind technicians are among the fastest growing jobs in America. It's difficult to imagine the United States winning the long-term strategic competition with China if we cannot lead the renewable energy revolution. Right now, we're falling behind. China is the largest producer and exporter of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles. It holds nearly 1/3 of the world's renewable energy patents. If we don't catch up, America will miss the chance to shape the world's climate future in a way that reflects our interests and values, and we'll lose out on countless jobs for the American people. Now, let me be clear. Goal number one of our climate policy is preventing catastrophe. We're rooting for every country, business, and community to get better at cutting emissions and building resilience. But that doesn't mean we don't have a stake in America developing these innovations and exporting them to the world. And it doesn't mean we don't want to shape the way countries reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change. So how can we do that? We can start with leading by the power of our example. As we work to meet our ambitious climate targets, the following core principles will guide our approach. We will significantly increase our investment in clean energy research and development because it's how we will catalyze breakthroughs that benefit American communities and create American jobs. In all our climate investments, we will aim not only to promote growth, but also equity. We'll be inclusive, focusing on providing Americans across the country and from a range of communities with good-paying jobs and the opportunity to join a union. We'll empower youth, not just because they will bear more of the consequences of climate change, but also because of the urgency, ingenuity, and leadership they've demonstrated in confronting this crisis. We will enlist states, cities, businesses, large and small, civil society, and other coalitions as partners and models. Others have been doing groundbreaking work in this field for a long time. We'll lift them up and share best practices. And this is important. We will be mindful that for all the opportunities offered by the unavoidable shift to clean energy, not every American worker will win out in the near term. Some livelihoods and communities that relied on old industries will be hit hard. We won't leave those Americans behind. We'll provide our fellow Americans with pathways to new, sustainable livelihoods and support as they navigate this transition.